Hello and welcome to this discussion of all things nuclear and uranium. My name's Andrew Hines. I am the Head of Research at Shaw & Partners, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Brandon Munro, who's the Executive Chairman of Bannerman Energy and also on the World Nuclear Association Advisory Committee. So who better to talk to us about all the recent developments in the global nuclear industry. Brandon's recently back from London, where the WNA held their annual symposium. And Brandon, I understand it was a very optimistic session where lots of positive news recently about the industry globally has got the industry optimistic about the future.
Well, it really was buoyant, Andrew. This is an event which is really the largest event in the world for the broader nuclear industry. It's everything from the very front end of the cycle with uranium mining all the way through nuclear power and medical applications and everything that you can really imagine when it comes to the civilian nuclear power industry. The mood was astonishingly buoyant, and I say that because I've been going to this event for many years and I've been able to track the industry as a whole and their concerns and their anxieties about the burden that this sector has to deliver for really mankind and society and decarbonisation. And the excitement was palpable because the opportunity is real at the moment in nuclear power, and the discussion had shifted over the last couple of years. Might have been more about, are these demand signals real? Can we count on them? Is it really going to happen? That was an absolute given this year. And the focus was entirely, how does this broader nuclear power sector deliver on its potential?
Yeah, it is quite amazing, the change in the sentiment of this sector in the last 12 months. Brandon, last year in Dubai at COP28, we had quite a remarkable event where over 20 countries made a pledge to triple their nuclear capacity by 2050, which is just an absolute watershed moment in the outlook for this sector. And governments around the world, I think, have realised that this whole decarbonisation process is unachievable without nuclear being a key part of that solution. There is no alternative baseload power to coal than nuclear or hydro, and hydro is not suitable for a lot of locations. So the other development recently, and perfect timing for this discussion and for the meetings we've been having recently, lots of news out of the US in particular around data centres, artificial intelligence, and all the big tech companies now starting to underwrite restarts of reactors, underwrite the purchase of small modular reactors. So I think we've had Amazon, we've had Google, we've had Microsoft all in the last 2 weeks make some announcements. And what's your take on these private tech companies and the impact they may have on this demand for this sector?
Well, it's a very important development for this sector because what it's doing is it's underscoring a couple of the key thematics that will continue to drive the uranium trade forward, not in the next couple of years, but for an entire cycle. So if you start looking at them, the first one is we've now moved from an era of shutting down reactors, largely for economic or political reasons around the world, to restarting reactors. And that is an inflection point in our sector. There's another thematic around how long does it take SMRs, small modular reactors, to come into the market, to become commercialised, to be produced at scale, and thereby have a large impact on uranium demand. There were many sceptics, fair enough, rightfully so, and the prevailing industry view until very recently was they won't have an impact on demand until well into the 2030s, probably the back end 2040. And now with these announcements, we're seeing, I think, the tip of the iceberg with very large corporates, state-sized corporates, who are prepared to throw significant amounts of capital, 500 million or so, at ensuring that those SMRs are in commercial deployment this decade. I see the tech companies as being the first of a string of large-scale industrial applications who must have nuclear power in order to come close to meeting their decarbonisation goals.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable when you consider that I think this is probably the first time in history, really, that this industry has actually had an urgency on the demand pool. Previously it's been governments and the big utilities driving investment in nuclear, and maybe back in the 1970s with the oil shocks you had governments sort of pushing the industry a little bit, but really this is the first time now that we've seen the private sector actually get and really demand capacity.
It's a great point, a really important point, Andrew, because this is a customer-driven demand growth story. And unlike governments, customers, they have, in these cases, urgent commercial needs with vast consequences. So for a Microsoft who's competing with these other giants, or a Google or an Amazon Web Services or a string of other tech giants, they're competing against each other. And if they can't have 24/7 power that's clean, they're going to lose market share. Potentially catastrophically, like it's a really competitive game in big tech.
Yeah.
That is a identical process to what's happening at a state-by-state basis in the US. And also, I think over time, you'll see that at a nation-by-nation basis. Countries will start to understand that if they don't provide the power environment to entice tech companies to house their data centres and their other tech infrastructure inside their own borders, those jobs, those opportunities, that investment will go across the border to a country that does have clean baseload power. And as you've said, the choices available at the moment are hydro and nuclear, and hydro is for a select lucky few.
So, Brandon, that's great. We've talked about SMRs and the tech firms and their demand, but what's happening elsewhere in demand in China, in the rest of the world?
So China's going great guns, as we said. They've got a target of 10 new reactor builds per year for at least the next 15 years. And when you look at what they need to achieve with that, I think that you can expect that once they're tooled up and operating efficiently at that level, as we're now seeing, they're going to be asking themselves the real question of why stop there.
Yep.
The rest of the world has pivoted enormously over the last few years. Countries like South Korea, which has one of the biggest fleets and the superior Western capability when it comes to nuclear reactor builds, as demonstrated in the UAE, they've very recently pivoted from an anti-nuclear government that was closing reactors down and stopping construction to the complete opposite, where they're restarting the reactor constructions that they had, and they're now going full on towards building new reactors domestically and also competing in other markets, most notably and recently Czech Republic. That experience has been reflected in countries like the UK, which is pushing forward really hard on their Rolls-Royce SMR design, Belgium, which has reversed their anti-nuclear policy, and really there's just a couple of names on that map that still haven't seen the light, and one of those is Germany, although the CSU is now proposing as their election platform at the next election that they will restart 5 reactors in Germany. And of course, where we're filming from here, Australia, and I'd rather not take the conversation into that direction because it's just a little bit too depressing, Australia's energy policy right now.
You don't have to talk about it. I'll make the comment, though. I think it's inevitable. Eventually, Australia goes down the nuclear path. So I think the conversation is starting to happen around the Australian community, and clearly it's very political at the moment, but taking politics out of it, it just makes so much sense. And we in Australia are probably one of the only places in the world now that haven't recognised that nuclear has a big role to play.
And I think if you look at the US, that's perhaps the best analogue in a single market of what's happening in demand in this sector. So I've been closely involved in supply and demand dynamics, as you know, at World Nuclear Association with our own modelling, and by chairing the Nuclear Fuel Demand Committee within WNA, that gave me access to what a very broad range of executives were thinking around the sector. And the one topic that was never really up for debate was the US growth was going to be static to low. And we saw over the course of me chairing that committee, reactors turn off in the US, and now there's 93 reactors currently operating. Until a year ago, no one could credibly put forward the idea that you would see growth of any scale. Yes, some SMRs, but not large-scale conventional reactors. Fast forward by only 12 months, and the Department of Energy a couple of weeks ago published a report saying that they can identify the opportunity at existing sites for fast-tracked approval to another 60 gigawatts of new installed capacity in the US, on the road to the need for 200 gigawatts of installed capacity that will enable the US to achieve what it needs to in maintaining its tech hegemony at the same time as a decarbonised economy. Now that's more than a tripling of their current capacity. Now that is a good analogue for just how much this sector has changed in only 12 months. So for anyone out there who's watching this, if you haven't looked deeply at this sector in literally the last few months, you're actually going to be somewhat misinformed when it comes to a lot of these demand developments.
Remarkable sea change. So, this is an industry, as we just said, that's hasn't had the demand pull. We've now gone to a demand pull. Demand is growing again, really for the first time since Fukushima. On the other side of the coin, Brandon, let's talk about the nuclear fuel side, and where is the supply of fuel going to come from to fuel all these reactors that are being built now. And the reality is today we are not producing enough uranium just for the existing fleet, so let alone all this growth is going to come from. And I struggle to think of any other sector where we've had such a downturn as we've seen in uranium post Fukushima, which an accident that basically saw the nuclear industry go into hibernation for more than a decade. So no exploration happening in uranium, no new mines being developed, a whole bunch of skills and IP lost from the industry as companies disappeared. And it's now come back to life again, but from an incredibly low base of potential new projects and potential new supply. So what do you think is going to happen on the supply side here, Brandon? Where is the supply coming from at the moment, and what risks do you see to that supply?
Well, at the moment, the supply is coming from existing producers, the round of restarts, which have now effectively entered the market. So all of those mines that were mothballed during the bleak times that you referred to post-Fukushima, by and large, they're all reproducing now. And they're producing, and we still don't have enough uranium. Then you say, well, okay, so which new mines are just around the corner? And that's a very thin list, and that's why people are interested in talking to me, because Etango Bannerman's project is one of a handful of greenfields uranium projects that are permitted and construction ready around the world. So in the short term, we're going to need to see market signals in this sector that incentivise absolutely everything that's capable of coming into production, but also start generating the investment required in exploration and development to start fueling this runaway demand. Those market signals are great news for uranium investors, of course, and they're great news for companies like myself who've done the hard yards and now got a project that's in the early stages of construction. But they're also really important to the sector because this sector, the nuclear power sector, is growing rapidly. Those subtle time differences between a mid-30s and a late 20s, if that demand comes in at late 20s, the reason it bites so hard in favour of the uranium thesis is because supply will really struggle to stay in front of that demand. And we already have a deficit in this sector which is projected to grow, and it will grow even faster because of the nature of the announcements that we've had in the last 2 weeks. And as I say, I see that as being the tip of the iceberg.
Yep.
We haven't even talked about chemicals companies. We haven't even talked about oil and gas companies needing to decarbonise their refining and other downstream applications. We haven't talked about industrial heat. We haven't talked about the ability for nuclear power to provide a superior form of green hydrogen through hot electrolysis and thermochemical processes. There's a whole raft of industries that have to decarbonise in fairly short order and can't get there with variable renewable energy, and they're under various pressures to stop using fossil fuels, and that leaves one alternative. So for the uranium thesis, the demand will be relentless, and to a degree that demand is price insensitive.
Yeah,
Therefore, that provides the growth and the room for market signals to do what they're going to need to incentivise that level of new supply.
Yeah, I think that's a great point on the other industries too, Brandon, because once these SMRs do reach commercial production, which seems to be being dragged forward now by the tech companies, the use applications for SMRs is enormous. I mean, why wouldn't remote communities have an SMR rather than rely on intermittent renewables? Why wouldn't remote mining sites, as you say, refineries? The applications for SMRs are enormous. So we could see, nuclear as a percentage of global energy generation really go to very high levels. So it's a good point. On the supply side at the moment, you're spot on. We are in deficit. I think we consume each year about 180 million pounds of uranium in the current reactor fleet. We're currently producing about 140 million pounds, so there's currently a deficit already of about 40. We can see, as you say, the restarts coming in to fill that gap, but we still are in effectively an inventory drawdown period at the moment. The utilities are not replacing their pounds. They're not fully contracted. So although we've seen the uranium price rally enormously from its lows, obviously got down to $17, $20, somewhere around there at the depth of the despair. We're back in the 80s now. But we're still not at a point where the markets have hit equilibrium. So we haven't yet seen where that true equilibrium price of the uranium price needs to get to, because we're not back in equilibrium supply and demand. So the uranium price could go considerably higher than where we are now.
A really pertinent point. So for some investors who have seen uranium grow strongly and then might be disappointed that it seems to be tapering at the moment in the mid-80s and the spot price has come off, I think this is a point that must not go unnoticed. Utilities are not yet at replacement level contracting, as you say. So the demand for uranium is significantly less than the consumption of uranium. And I would believe that that deficit is actually less than the supply gap at the moment. So it's as if at $83 a pound, which is today's uranium price, the sector is not responding as if it's in deficit. What then happens when utilities realise that they can't continue drawing down on inventory and they do need to achieve replacement contracting? Well, the sector is going to find out what happens to market signals and terms and conditions when utilities need to obtain that delta that isn't available because of a supply deficit. Where that becomes super interesting is if that becomes a signal for utilities in general to start reevaluating, well, what is the right level of risk mitigation given the increasing demand signals that we're seeing out, particularly through the 2030s? The fact that supply has been very slow to restart for systemic reasons that we've already covered. The fact that some of the biggest and best mines in the world are depleting by 2030 without adequate replacement. And the fact that we've got China that's growing like a juggernaut at the rate of 10 gigawatts per year.
Yeah.
Even the 10 announced in 2022 are already all in construction, and half of the 10 reactors announced in China in 2023 are already in construction. So when you add all of that up, they are the ingredients for utilities as a whole to start looking hard at their risk mitigation strategies and the level of inventory that they think is appropriate. And when this sector flips from destocking through replacement level contracting into restocking, I think we're really going to understand what market signals are required to address that long-term supply gap. And that is an extremely exciting proposition for uranium investors at the moment.
Absolutely. Look, our own forecast, Brandon, as you know, we've got a price deck out there predicting that uranium prices at the spot level go to $150 a pound by the end of calendar year 25, which I think if I'd made that forecast 2 years ago, I'd have been laughed at. But now that's entirely realistic, and maybe 150 is even conservative. Maybe we go higher than that.
It's a market that doesn't have structural limits on the upside. So if you then, yes, every market as it goes up, every commodities market has certain points where there's friction. But in this case, in the short term, it's really hard to identify any systemic ceilings on what the price could achieve. And I think that gives investors the opportunity and the obligation to really test different scenarios as to where price can go, and of course make sure that they're positioned accordingly.
Yeah, indeed. There is risks in the current supply. Kazatomprom, which is the world's biggest producer of uranium now, from Kazakhstan, recently came out with some downgrades to their calendar year 25 production forecast, and I think the market still thinks that those are probably optimistic numbers, and there may be further downgrades. We've woken up in this world where we've become sort of overly reliant on one particular country for a whole bunch of our uranium supply. Do you think that's causing angst amongst the utilities in the US and Europe about access to that supply?
Well, at the moment it certainly is. Angst is a relative word, but if you look at the world through the lens of a utility risk committee, so they've invested tens of billions of dollars in a nuclear power plant. There's a community and a society around them that is utterly dependent on that nuclear power plant staying in existence. And the one key risk that would keep a fuel buyer all the way through to the board of a utility awake at night is running out of fuel. Now, I'm not going to say that the lights are going to turn off, but utilities will, if pressed, take extraordinary steps to make sure that that is not a realistic or possible risk. That's when you use that filter and you look at an incredibly concentrated supply base. You have one country that's responsible for more than 40% of the world's supply of uranium, but more so, the top 6 countries in the world are responsible for about 95% of the world's uranium production. You then look at how commercially concentrated this sector is, and basically 3 producers absolutely dominate the market: Kazatomprom, Orano, and Cameco. Now, you can add Rosatom to that list, although they're not really featuring that much anymore in our Western market. So there's an enormous amount of supply density, and utilities are very interested in diversifying geographically and diversifying commercially their supply costs. Now, because of all of that, when a country like Kazakhstan experiences supply difficulties as a secondary implication of the war in Ukraine, they can't easily export out of St. Petersburg, which has been the dominant port for exporting all of their production since 2008. That's the sort of thing that makes utilities nervous. That's the sort of thing that makes utilities really want to have a conversation with a company like ourselves that offers that geographic and commercial diversity, with the advantage, of course, that we come from an established uranium jurisdiction, being Namibia. So it is on utilities' minds.
Yep.
Is it causing angst and panic? Well, not yet, but there are risks and there are scenarios that would quickly elevate into that mindset.
Yeah, indeed. Let's change tack a little bit then, Brandon. So we've set the scene there, an industry back in growth, lack of supply. As you say, great time to be talking about Bannerman. I think the share price was up 10% yesterday on the back of all these headlines coming out of the US around the tech companies, and clearly it's a sector that's back in focus for investors all around the globe now. Tell us a bit more about Bannerman Energy. So what have you been doing with the company over the last decade whilst the industry's been in hibernation, and how have you kept the lights on at Bannerman, and what have you been doing with your main project, Etango?
So thank you. We have the Etango project in Namibia. It's our sole focus. It's a very advanced project. We did discover the project in 2006, so we've had a lot of time to de-risk that project. And that's pretty typical for bringing on a uranium mine. As you know, the world's richest uranium mine, Cigar Lake, from discovery to first production was 35 years. Now, we expect to do a lot better than that, but it does take a long time to bring on a uranium mine in this world. I came into the company as CEO in 2016 when things were really tough. Like, to use the word bleak, I don't think sufficiently credits how masochistic uranium executives really were in those days. It was tough. Just to get a meeting was tough. In 2017, as you said, the uranium price went below $18. We took a decision at that time that we had an asset that was almost unique in the world, that was very advanced when most assets weren't. And there was a value to that we needed to judiciously and cautiously continue advancing that asset during those very difficult times when capital was difficult, so that when we get to the other side, when uranium price starts to progress to levels that are interesting for a company like us, when the demand signals are starting to overwhelm available and prospective supply, that we have an asset that's ready.
Yep.
And it does genuinely give me a lot of pride that we fast forward to 2024. The beginning of the year, I handed over to an exceptionally capable CEO in Gavin Chamberlain, who's built mines for 30 years in Southern Africa, mines 10 times as complex as what we're asking him to do at Etango. And we've come out the other end, not only achieving that project readiness with a bunch of optionality, but today's cash balance is about 3 times the market cap of the entire company when I took over in 2016. So it hasn't been an easy journey, but it is one that we look back on with a fair and I think a reasonable degree of pride as to how we did navigate those very, very difficult and treacherous waters over the period since Fukushima.
Yeah, look, it's a key point in terms of getting the skills back into the company to go and build mines. And Gavin's a great hire that you've made. For those who don't know Gavin's background, he was responsible for building the Husad mine was project director for the Husad mine, which is probably the biggest of the mines in Namibia, I think.
Yeah, largest uranium mine in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a great addition to the executive team. It's not just Gavin. You've also got people in country who understand how to operate and how to navigate through the political corridors of Namibia. Which it itself, I think people might sort of question Namibia. It's Africa. Is that difficult? I think Namibia must be one of the best locations in the world to be building a uranium mine.
I would absolutely endorse that. So let's chat about Namibia for a moment. You've been there recently.
I have.
You enjoyed it, from what I understand.
Great. Yeah, Swakopmund was a terrific town, and the site visit out to the Etango project was excellent. Yeah, really good.
So Namibia is one of the topics that occasionally comes up. And the reason it's occasional is anyone who's done a deep dive on Namibia, that's the end of the conversation. They get that everything that you said is right. With Botswana, Namibia is in a league of its own in Africa. It's a premier uranium development jurisdiction in the world, partly because you can get things done there, and partly because uranium mining is so warmly endorsed by the local community and politically supported. And then you get occasional questions because somebody who might not be that familiar with Africa doesn't understand just how stratified and just how diverse the 50 or so nations across the continent are. And that's understandable because the types of countries in Africa that make it to Hollywood are not the ones that are stable operating jurisdictions. And for some people, that's their view of Africa. And now that you've been to Namibia and I've spent a lot of time there, it is worth focusing on just what a pleasure it is to operate and develop in Namibia. So if you think about, well, what makes the difference? Uranium mining is really tough. It's tough like any form of mining, but it's tough in particular when you don't have political support, when you have environmental complications, when you've got social complications. Those things are all appropriate to a degree because like any form of mining, uranium mining imposes a particular responsibility to do the right thing. But in many jurisdictions, including our home country of Australia, that pendulum has swung too far towards activism, both in government and out of government, sophisticated tools used by parties who don't want to see any form of mining, let alone uranium mining, including lawfare and other very sophisticated tools, where the whole emphasis has shifted from ensuring that the regulator enforces world-class responsible levels of conduct to simply blocking a project at all costs.
Yep.
Namibia, like any African country, needs development. They need jobs. They need opportunities. They need all of the social fabric and infrastructure that mining delivers there. And so for that reason, the focus is on doing things the right way, not battling third-party interests who don't have an interest in seeing responsible mining. They have an interest in seeing no mining whatsoever.
Yep.
It's not a feature of operating there. The local people are welcoming a new mining development. You've been to Swakopmund, you've seen that half the infrastructure of the town was built by Rio Tinto because Rossing's been going for 45 years and is still going.
Yep.
When you run through senior bureaucracy, even politicians in the country, there's a substantial proportion of people who've really part of their professional development has been working at Rossing. So there's a really good understanding of why mining and uranium mining in particular is so important to Namibia.
Well, that's great, Brandon. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on Namibia, a fantastic place to operate. Let's go back to your team for the moment. Just tell us a bit more about your team you've built and their backgrounds.
Yeah, so you've met a few of them actually.
I have.
So we talked about Gavin Chamberlain. Werner Ewald is our managing director in country. Now, we understood very early in this process that mining was our single biggest cost and we wanted the best mining guy in the game. So Werner was head of mining at Rossing Uranium Mine, joined us in 2010, based in Swakopmund, a really integral part of the community, and he has come to personify all of the values and culture that we have at Bannerman. So very important with trust with the local community, trust with government, and a great guy to beat. Tuapewa Kadikwa is our chairlady in country. She's something of a TV personality. She's a very well accomplished entrepreneur. As you've seen yourself, she's got ample energy to go around. Yep. And a truly inspiring leader, someone who can capture the imagination of our host community and the workforce that we will be building on site. Moving to London, Olga Skolyakova, she joined us just over a year ago, and she was really a key hire for us. Penetration into the nuclear sector is not particularly easy for an Australian junior sitting in Perth. And whilst I've had the opportunity to engage a lot with our colleagues in the downstream industry, finding somebody who can market your company and market your uranium and at the end of the day get the contracts done is an enormous challenge, and Olga is an absolute superstar. She's done everything in this sector from being in charge of WNA supply-demand modelling all the way through to selling enrichment into the US. So you can imagine some of the topical issues in the sector at the moment, she understands deeply. So she's been a huge addition to the company. And then when it looks to preparing ourselves for execution, we can point to our CFO, Steve Hurley here. He's worked at the small end of town and he's worked all the way up to the biggest end of town, where he was financial controller globally for BHP Iron Ore. He sat on BHP's global strategy and leadership team. So he brings a real depth of calm financial experience to the company that we can grow into as we grow to becoming really quite a substantial mine. We're laying in the next layer of management beneath those people. So we've got a fantastic project manager who's joined us. We've got an amazing commercial manager who sits in Johannesburg. We've got a team in Wood at the moment of about 70 people working on detailed design. And we've got the core of a really good team in Namibia who will help us expand into the culture that we want for what will become a 750-person operation. The strategy has been to make sure that we've got deep experience in Namibia and deep experience in uranium amongst the senior echelons, and then that enables us to work within the natural workforce that exists within the vibrant mining industry that we have in Namibia.
Yeah, great. And so, Etango, where are we at now? What's the latest developments? I think you've actually started construction, so it's a real project. It's happening. There's activity on the ground.
Yeah, so we've largely finished all of the pre-construction infrastructure. So we have a water reservoir built on site. We're pumping water to that to enable us to have construction water. We've built the access road to site. Now, admittedly, the infrastructure is fantastic around the project, so it was only a 7-kilometre access road from the sealed highway, right. But all the same, we've built it. And now we're moving on with bulk earthworks, and that is a significant part of our construction proper. It's a 24-month contract. It's something that we've funded from our existing cash reserves, and it's a really important contract to let. It forms really the backbone, both in a timing sense and in a physical sense, for all of the subsequent construction that needs to take place on site.
Yep.
So without the bulk earthworks, we can't install the primary crusher. Without the bulk earthworks, we can't start constructing the ponds and the pads for the heap leach operation. So it's a vitally important contract to let. And what that does is, by letting that contract, continuing with detailed design, doing the on-site roadworks and a couple of other long lead items, funded from our current cash balance, it means that we can continue moving the project forward whilst we take our time to optimise our entry point into the market. In other words, the timing that we decide to start layering in our contract portfolio as this term contracting market starts to develop and prosper.
Yeah, I think that the word you used earlier in the discussion was flexibility, which clearly that's what you need in this sort of market where, as we talked about before, we haven't found the equilibrium price yet of uranium. And the question always comes, what is the incentive price that's required to get the new projects built? Well, you can literally count on one hand the number of new projects. So effectively, Brandon, you're setting the incentive price here. It's the price that you're happy to accept to sign contracts with utilities for Etango.
Well, I'm not sure I'm quite comfortable with that responsibility, but the point is well made that there are so few data points to be able to say what an incentive price is, because there's so few projects around the world that are capable of coming into production at any price right now. Yep. And we're one of those. But also the nature of long-term contracting has changed a lot. A lot of long-term contracts will be market related. So investors will have the security of a floor in those contracts, and it's our job to negotiate a ceiling for those particular contracts that enables this asset to perform with the leverage to higher uranium prices that a lot of investors are buying into.
Absolutely.
That and the fact that we've got time to layer in contracts. It's not a singular event. It's not a single offtake where that now sets the price and therefore sets the economics for our project. We'll be layering in those contracts until we're very close to production. So if the uranium market behaves in the way that I anticipate it will, we'll be progressively improving that contract book and therefore improving investors' exposure to uranium. And the beautiful thing about it is we've then got the expansion capacity.
Yeah.
So we start at £3.5 million, we get into production, and then we make the decision, well, do we effectively double our processing capacity, which then increases from £3.5 million to £6.7 million in an enormously risk-controlled environment compared to going and building a new mine somewhere else.
Yep.
And we get a real second bite at the cherry, so that with all of the news that we've had in the last 2 weeks about data centres and the tip of the iceberg in terms of this industrial urgent demand pressure on our sector, if even a small proportion of that comes to bear, then we've got this additional capacity that we can then contract into the dynamics of that future market.
Yeah, I think it's a super important point. You're sitting on a project it's an enormous resource. It's well over 200 million pounds of uranium in the ground, and the expandability of that resource gives you all sorts of options. And this is potentially a 40-year asset. So doing the right things at the start of the project, not giving away value, protecting shareholder value over the medium to long term, maintaining your flexibility and your optionality is really, really important with a project of this size.
And we owe it to shareholders. The people have been in this company since 2006. It's been a long, hard road during the difficult times. And so we don't take for granted the fact that, yes, we do have economic prices in the market at the moment, but there needs to be a commensurate reward for that patience and that risk over the journey.
Yeah, great. Well, that's been a fantastic conversation, Brandon. Look, clearly it's a sector that's back in the headlines for all the right reasons now. After, as I said, well over a decade of being in the doldrums post the Fukushima incident, we've now got demand growing again. We've got the tech companies investing and trying to get hold of SMR technology, which is an absolute sea change for the industry. So demand growing again, and yet we've got industry that's undersupplied for current consumption. The market's getting really tight for uranium. There's a whole bunch of opportunities that investors can get exposure to on the ASX for uranium investments, and Bannerman Energy is one of our favourites. So speak to your Shaw and Partners advisor if you want to get hold of research from Shaw and Partners on Bannerman. For the record, our recommendation is buy. We've got a price target on Bannerman of $7.40. I think the share price closed up 10% yesterday at $3.50 odd, I think. So there's still a lot of upside still to go on our numbers. Thank you, Brandon. It's been fantastic, and good luck with the Etango project over the next few years.
Thanks, Andrew. It's going to be an exciting road.
Terrific.